do you own yourself? The concept of self-ownership is meant to capture a seductively simple idea along the slogan, "My body, my choice." After all, the rights we have over ourselves take the same form as rights that we have over other things we own. So I get to decide what to do with myself or my body, and nobody else gets to interfere with me or my body unless I consent to them doing so. We also treat many aspects of our body just like property. So perhaps when we give away body parts, right, by donating blood, perhaps even donating an organ. Some people sell their hair to wig makers, right? So that seems like literally using your body like property. You might also think when we engage in wage labor, we're selling our labor. So the rights we have over ourselves start to look analogous to, or maybe even the same as, ownership rights over other things like land, for example. Now, some of you may be thinking right now, well, hang on a second. If we think about land ownership, for example, that is often limited in various ways. There might be limits on what you can do with your land, how you can build on it. Or there might be rights of public access over privately owned land in ways that make land ownership start to look quite disanalogous to the rights we have over our bodies. Hold that thought. We will be digging into that question shortly. But the promise of self-ownership is that this idea is meant to be able to help us explain the similarities between the rights we have over ourselves and our bodies and the rights we can have over other things that we own as property. And it's meant to be able to explain the connection between ourselves and our property, to explain something about the significance of at least some of our property rights, where it seems like sometimes when you intrude on my property, in some ways it feels kind of personal as well. But of course there are problems with this concept, right? So there are various reasons that are going to count against ownership, the idea of self-ownership. So you might think there are just really important points of moral difference between ourselves and our bodies and other things in the world that we can own as property. So thinking in terms of property rights over ourselves might fail to capture the moral significance of the body or the person. Property tends to be quite disposable, right? If I own something, I can sell it, I can give it away, I can chuck it away if I want. But should I have the right to sell my kidney? Many of us might think, no. Is assault on the body the same type of wrong as trespass on land? Plausibly not, right? There seems to be something more serious we want to be able to capture in a different way to saying these are just the same kinds of rights infringement. So when thinking about spheres of ownership, or at least possible spheres of ownership, the puzzle seems to be this. On the one hand, the general structure of rights that we have over ourselves and other things that we own looks the same. But of course, the shape of ownership rights can vary over different types of thing, perhaps depending on the type of thing in question. And we also recognize that some things that we own have some kind of personal significance to us, such that when people interfere with our property, stuff that's not us, it does feel personal. So the quote on the slide there from David Schmitz and Bas van der Vossen saying, when our homes get burgled, it feels like it's we who got violated. It's a metaphor, but not merely a metaphor, right? This idea that maybe there is some deeper connection between the personal domain of ourselves and some of the things that we own. So the question here is really kind of what's the link, if any, between the significance of at least some of our property rights and self-ownership? Can the concept of self-ownership tell us anything about what kind of ownership rights we ought to have over ourselves and other things and what kind of shape they should take? Now, why does this all matter? You might think, is this just going to be, philosophers labeling things in different ways? What practical implications does this have? Well, how we think of the rights that we have over ourselves and what we think of self-ownership is relevant to practical questions about the limits of certain markets. So, for example, markets in contentious bodily services, for example, sex work or commercial surrogacy, markets in human gametes, human organs or cadavers, and even questions about the accumulation of property rights over things like gene patents and personal data. All these things connect in interesting ways to the concept of self-ownership, and I think there's a way of thinking about self-ownership that can help us illuminate our thinking about these areas. But first, I'll take you through an approach to self-ownership that I think doesn't work. So some approaches to self-ownership take self-ownership as a kind of foundational form of ownership. So people who take this view typically think self-ownership is a basic moral right that people have just by virtue of being persons. And if self-ownership is foundational, then it must also be some particularly full or maximal kind of ownership. So the ownership rights you have over yourself must be the maximum possible extent of ownership rights compatible with everyone else having the same over their own selves. What does that mean? Well, Robert Nozick, for example, argues that self-ownership then must include full alienability. So you must be able to sell any aspect of yourself, perhaps even at the limit, sell yourself into slavery, right? If you were really freely making a decision to do so. And it also includes very stringent rights against interference, which for Nozick includes stringent rights against taxation. And that's because he thinks, well, if I agree with someone else to work for a certain wage and then the state taxes 20% of my salary, that involves the state taking 20% of my labor time. So he thinks that taxation is akin to forced labor on this kind of foundational view of self-ownership. So you may or may not disagree with those implications, right? But there's a problem with that kind of view, which is that it just seems like it relies on conflicting intuitions about the nature of property on the one hand and the nature of ourselves on the other. So it seems to involve leaning on this idea that on the one hand, because the self is so important, ownership rights have to include these very stringent rights against interference with ourselves, and then to the extent that that connects with property, we get very stringent rights against any sort of interference with our property. And on the other hand, it also leans on this seemingly conflicting intuition that, well, once we're talking about property rights, property is kind of disposable. You can sell it, you can do anything you want with it. And so the ownership rights we have over the self must include that kind of alienability or ability to dispose of them as well. So for that reason, this view, I think, doesn't give us a satisfactory answer as to the varied significance of different spheres of ownership and how they interact and connect in various ways, which the promise of self-ownership was meant to be able to do that. Okay, so you might be thinking, right, let's just ditch the concept of self-ownership then. Let's just think of the rights we have over ourselves in some different way. But if we ditch the idea of self-ownership, I think we're going to have trouble explaining certain aspects of practices like cutting off your hair to sell it to a wig maker, right? At least to the extent that one might think that once you've detached your hair, you get to decide who to sell it to or give it away to or to chuck it because it's yours, right? Because it's your hair, and you get to decide that and not anybody else. So that, I think, gives us reason to go back to the concept of self-ownership and to see if we can develop an account of ownership and self-ownership that builds from some view about the importance of the self and connects that to other things in a way that can help us to explain the significance of different spheres of ownership. So to start on that front, we can start by going back to this question of why is ownership important in the first place? So when you own something, what that means is that you have the authority to control the terms on which others can interact with what you own. And some philosophers have argued that we can understand the significance of ownership by recognizing part of what's so bad about the state of homelessness. So when a person is homeless, there's no space in which she has the authority to control how things are between her and other people, to set the terms as to how things are between her and other people. So when we're thinking about that kind of authority that we can have, it seems pretty clear that the most important sphere over which we need that kind of authority is over ourselves and our bodies. But it also seems very important that we have some minimal sphere of space, so some shelter in which we also have that kind of authority, somewhere we can kind of shut out the world, as it were. So, the solution I propose in terms of how to think about self-ownership in a way that can illuminate our thinking about these different spheres of ownership is to move away from the idea that full self-ownership is kind of foundational and captures the moral importance of the self, and instead focus on the way that ownership rights structure the spaces between us and what they function to protect. And I think we can do so in light of a basic commitment of liberalism to kind of strike the balance between the individual's control over her own life, what's required for us to really live freely as individuals, and to balance that with the demands of living in community with one another. Okay, a slightly technical slide here going into what some people call the sort of molecular aspect of property right. But the point being that when you own something, you have various different privileges and claims with respect to that thing. But what seems key, the key element of ownership that I focus on, is this power to exert or operate your ownership rights, right? So when you own something, you kind of have the power to open or close the gates of the thing that you own, to give other people permission to use it in various ways. And so what's important, I think, from the perspective that I want to focus on, is that individuals not only be recognized as having this kind of core power of ownership, but also that they have the material and social conditions in place to allow them to reliably exercise it. So from that perspective, we can think of self-ownership as basic insofar as we must protect individuals' ability to function as owners, to exert that core power of ownership. And that, I think, is just always going to require some minimum sphere of ownership rights over yourself and your body. And it's also going to require some minimum of other property, of ownership rights over other things in the world, right? Starting with, for example, a place to call home. Somewhere where you can just shut out the world if you want to. And then following on from that, for any item of property, we can understand its significance by how important it is to protecting a person's core power of ownership. So to talk you through some examples of what that might look like, let's go back to the question of, well, why is it personally intrusive when someone breaks into your house? Is that an example of kind of interference with property that, in a sense, gets at self-ownership? Well, we can explain it in this way. A burglary is a more direct threat to your core power of self-ownership. So, of course, it might cause some economic damage or loss to you, right? But beyond that, a burglary can have psychological impacts on a person that affect her ability to exercise her core power of ownership. What about the question of selling organs, right? So we might think, we plausibly want to allow people to donate their organs, right? But perhaps not to sell them. So should you be able to sell your kidney? Well, I think actually there's probably nothing in the principle of self-ownership that would bar that kind of possibility. However, what we can say is that in any society with high levels of inequality, the existence of markets in human organs will put pressure on poor people to opt for risky surgeries. And so having laws that prevent people from alienating or selling their body parts in that way can be seen as serving to protect the core of self-ownership. It might be required from this perspective of self-ownership to limit people's ability to sell certain body parts. What about personal data, right? So Should we say that you own your personal data just because it emanated from you in some way, right? It's not really clear. But what we can say is that in a society where private companies have accumulated masses of personal data in a way that allows them to capture our attention and exert power over us and influence our decision-making, we have reason to treat personal data as belonging to individuals in a way that ought to include the power to reclaim it from others. So this approach to self-ownership allows us to understand the significance of the varied connections between people and their property in different social and economic contexts, and to understand how spheres of ownership play a part in structuring the spaces between us. Thank you.